He says he ended 8 wars in 8 months. Now, US President Donald Trump wants to make it 9 by brokering peace in Ukraine. Trump says he's optimistic he can do it. But with Russia testing a new nuclear-powered missile and Ukraine calling for more support, is Donald Trump the peacemaker he thinks he is? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Robyn Dwyer. When Presidents Putin and Trump met in Alaska in August, there was hope that an end to the war in Ukraine could be close. The lines of communication between Moscow and Washington are still open, but with the United States imposing new sanctions on Russia's oil industry and the Kremlin continuing to pursue its war aims, the prospects for peace talks seem to be drifting further away.
It's been dubbed the Flying Chernobyl, Russia's nuclear-capable cruise missile that, according to the Kremlin, can evade any defense system on Earth. It comes after President Trump had considered sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, something which, for now at least, is off the table. Russia has warned it would respond overwhelmingly to any long-range strikes into its territory.
There's a lot of speculation right now, and Zelensky himself stated that they allegedly possess the military potential to strike deep into Russia. Naturally, our armed forces and Russia will respond harshly to this, and as Putin said, staggeringly.
Talks between Washington and Moscow over ending the war in Ukraine are showing little signs of progress.
I don't think it's an appropriate thing for Putin to be saying either, by the way. He ought to get the war ended. A war that should have taken 1 week is now in its soon 4th year. That's what he ought to do instead of testing missiles.
The Kremlin insists it's still open to establishing dialogue with the United States over ending the war, but added that Russia still had to ensure its security in the face of a, quote, militaristic, Russophobic Europe gripped by hysteria. Trump now says he has ended 8 wars in 8 months. But this one, which he previously said he would solve within 24 hours of taking office, will require more than his force of personality to solve. The US president says he won't meet his Russian counterpart again until he thinks there is a deal on the table, with the world praying these two men will agree something to shake hands on before it's too late.
Joining me in the studio, we have Richard Sakfa, Emeritus Professor of Russian and European Politics. Also in the studio is Svetlana Moronets, a Ukrainian journalist and a staff writer at The Spectator. And in Washington, D.C., we have Rina Shah, the geopolitical advisor and strategist. Welcome to you all. Delighted to be having this conversation today. So, Rina, I want to begin with you. Lots of diplomatic moves recently from the US, in particular, placing new sanctions on Russia, on Russian oil companies. Does this perhaps signal the beginning of the end of Trump's policy of appeasing the Kremlin? What can we read into these new sanctions being put up?
Well, absolutely. The sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil are Trump's first real slap at Moscow since January. And ditching the quote-unquote warm calls for cold cash consequences, it's frustration with Putin's maximalism now that reads more like it's no more kid gloves that Trump is going to treat him with. If Putin does not want to broker and negotiate and get to a ceasefire tomorrow, expect for Trump to continue his current posturing. Of course, the question around Washington is always, can Trump even broker peace in Ukraine? And I'll say this, Trump's deal-making bravado met Putin's stonewalling in Anchorage, Alaska. But now with oil sanctions biting, the real test begins. And what we see now is that Trump can indeed broker peace if he leverages America's economic hammer. And it's because peace really demands Putin blinks first, not just endless photo opportunities.
And Richard, they have an interesting relationship, don't they, Presidents Putin and President Trump? President Trump has praised Putin in the past, calling him smart, calling him a strong leader, but things seem to have perhaps cooled a little recently. What do you make of their relationship?
Well, the first thing to say is that one has to say that the fact that Trump was trying to talk broker some sort of peace deal was to be welcome. However, I'm not sure what we mean by the word appeasement, because I can't see any concessions whatsoever made to the Russian position for not just in the last 4 years, but the last 30 years in terms of its security guarantees, non-NATO enlargement, neutrality for Ukraine, and so on. And the second point is the idea of a ceasefire. Trump understood at the beginning that the idea of demanding a ceasefire is a non-starter, because that would obviously just simply freeze where it is, and Russia's got the advantage on the battlefield. So if you're winning, why stop? And obviously, the fact that the idea of a ceasefire is a European idea, and of course with a backstop force and all the rest, which is simply also a non-starter. We have certain Russian concerns or demands for 30 years, and we need to get back to those.
And relationships are going to be important in this, aren't they? What about President Trump's relationship with President Zelensky? We all remember that exchange in the White House, that war of words. What can we infer from that on America's stance on Ukraine?
I wouldn't try to predict what Trump's stance on Ukraine will be even tomorrow, because Trump has been flip-flopping on Ukraine and Russia since he entered the office in January. And for Volodymyr Zelensky, it's been really a long and costly journey to convince Trump that peace through strength works only when pressure is applied on the aggressor, not of the victim of the aggression. And those new sanctions that Trump imposed against Russia, I would say it's a real victory for Ukraine, but we don't know what his stance will be tomorrow, and he could start pressuring Ukraine to give up the Russian terms again.
So, Richard, we talked about the sanctions. We had a prominent Russian businessman going to the United States, Kirill Dmitriev. What does that say about Putin's state of mind? Does that show that he's perhaps a little rattled about these latest sanctions?
Well, he certainly was trying to convince, as Svetlana is absolutely right, is that Trump seems to be listening to the last person who advises him. And Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, went over as a business person. He was hoping to, as it were, push back on the sanctions. It didn't work. He met Scott Bessent, the trade secretary, and got a very cold reception. He didn't manage to meet with anybody else, so that didn't really work. Obviously, these sanctions are a matter of concern, but they're not going to work. And so peace through strength is not the way it's going to work either, because Russia's got greater strength. I mean, it's simply got its war economy has geared up. I could give you all the figures of tanks, armored personal vehicles, artillery pieces, 155 millimeter shells, and it goes on. More than that, vast production, 60,000 drones a month. So if you want peace through strength, well, it's good luck to that, because it's unfortunately, sadly, as a person who loves Ukraine, they're now condemning themselves to destruction. There has to be peace. There has to be negotiations first to deal with the core issues, which isn't just a question of 4 years. It's a question of 30 years since the end of the Cold War. What terms will European security be based on? And it won't be based on NATO enlargement. It won't be based on giving Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, which is an insane idea in all respects, because that is, as even Biden, who was hardly compos mentis, understood that was World War III and Armageddon. So peace through strength is a complete failing proposition. We need to move to negotiations, we need to move to diplomacy, and we need to move to engagement to the substantive issue so that we can see a sovereign, democratic, independent Ukraine emerge as a neutral state, which is what it was when it declared independence in 1991 and all the way back until 2019, until NATO membership became part of the constitution. So that was the terms on which Ukraine became independent. It has reneged on its own terms.
Sorry, but Ukraine was neutral when Russia invaded in 2022, and Trump has been negotiating with Putin for 9 months, and nothing has happened. Volodymyr Zelensky agreed to unconditional ceasefire back in March, and Russia all this time has been stalling the talks. And the only time when Russia is trying to go back to the diplomatic table is when the pressure is put on Russia. When Trump threatened to sell Ukraine Tomahawk missiles, Putin called him immediately. This is how it works.
No, that I think is completely misunderstanding the whole situation. First of all, Ukraine was not neutral in 2022. By then, Ukraine was not in NATO, but NATO was fully in Ukraine. And the big debate in the last days of telephoning between Biden and Putin was about the Tomahawk missiles, as it happens. And so the idea of missile, which can get to Moscow in about a few minutes, and it could be nuclear armed, is just simply incredibly insane. I can't understand how anybody could even entertain the idea as such. And second, a ceasefire. On what terms? Why on earth should Russia accept a ceasefire at this moment in time when it's got the advantage on the...
Because he's losing thousands of men per week to capture 2 villages in the Donetsk region. He wasn't able to achieve any of his goals of his invasion. And all that he does is just spending thousands of people on the front line in a meat grinder for nothing.
Well, I want to talk about these Tomahawk missiles because President Trump clearly thinks that this is something that Ukraine could use. President Zelensky's asked for them. Rina, President Trump offered these Tomahawk missiles, then withdrew that offer for the moment. I mean, how critical could that be?
Oh, the missiles are very critical, but again, they haven't been given. This talk has been going on for quite some time. And what I would say is the sentiment in Washington right now, particularly among Republicans, is that the diplomacy that the Biden-Blinken duo attempted in the previous administration really failed. And so Trump is trying an all-of-the-above strategy right now. Tactic, not tombstone, is what I say. Trump's no ways to veto on Budapest really echoes his boardroom playbook. If you watched him for years here in these United States, he believes high-stakes preconditions are important. And he believes perhaps those preconditions could force Putin's hand. So what I see is stalemate only if Putin digs in. But with sanctions fresh, it's check, not checkmate here. And I think what we all ought to watch for is back channel buzz here. Deals really hide in the delays. And essentially what I'm also looking at when I see Trump's negotiation style is the unpredictability and its potential to really work here. With Trump, chaos is his currency. You know, warm Vladimir one day, oil embargo the next. What it does is unnerves Putin, who really thrives on scripts, not on surprises. And unpredictability could crack the Kremlin facade, and that could turn what is seen as bluster into a bargain. But there is also risk here. It spooks allies as well. And essentially, Trump needs to steer the wild card very wisely right now.
So we all know President Trump, well, a wild card is a good word for him, perhaps, unpredictable when it comes to negotiations, unpredictable when it comes to relationships, as we've just talked about. Svetlana, what do you think of the Trump effect? He claims he's solved 8 wars in 8 months. Do you think that his sheer personality could perhaps make some progress here?
Well, I'm not sure about those 8 or 9 wars that he already ended, but I really think that he and probably China are the only people who could end this war in Ukraine. And it all depends on what stance he takes, how he takes on to Putin's nuclear blackmail, because we saw those recent exercises of the new rockets. But what Putin is doing here is all what he did with Biden. Every time when Ukraine was offered a new weapon, for example, Leopard tanks or F-16s or Storm Shadows, every time Russia said, okay, we will start, there will be a nuclear escalation. But nothing happened in the end, and those weapons proved to be really useful for Ukraine. And you could see the successful campaign that Ukraine did, striking Russian oil refineries in recent months. And since January, over 20 have been attacked. And it's been like the most effective way to pressure Putin, because when he doesn't have the money for his war, he can't continue it. And especially taking into account that the majority of the Russian army are contracted soldiers. So they were signed contracts and been paid up to £50,000 in the first year for joining the army. When he doesn't have to pay them their salaries, nobody will be fighting there.
So Svetlana mentioned the influence of China. President Trump has said that he wants China to get involved here, to bring them to bear on Russia, to perhaps think again about what they're doing. What kind of difference would that make? Will China get involved, do you think?
Well, China is involved. It had a peace plan way back at the beginning, which wasn't a plan as such. It was some basic ideas. I've just come back from China, and the mood there is I think that we must be very careful not to live in our Western illusions, as it were. China, and the commitment there was quite clear, that if Russia loses this war, then China's next in the firing line. So one way or another, discreetly, the idea it could bring pressure to bear. Obviously, we all want to see this war end, and China, maybe as much as anyone else, India and all the others. But it has to end on the core issues, as the Russians like to say, being dealt with. Not a ceasefire, not more weapons. And of course, the fact is we've got a total stalemate. Even in the studio, we've got a stalemate. And unfortunately, which I'd like to see this stalemate broken, I'd like to see genuine negotiations. Talked about the Blinken-Biden diplomacy. There was no diplomacy. It was catastrophic. It led to this war. It could have been averted very easily. Right at the beginning, Ukraine will not join NATO and all the associated issues with it. So putting pressure on Moscow today, for example, its weakness, there are weaknesses in the economy. Yes, there is inflation. You're absolutely right. Coming down, interest rates 18%. However, the war economy is working at full pelt. It can continue for at least a few more years. Gold reserves are up by 500 tons, and so on and so forth. Again, I won't go into all the detail, but that's not the way to do it. Peace through strength is a complete dead-end way of going forward, and unfortunately, it's Ukrainian people who will suffer. We've got to have a genuine negotiation, not the type of Trump bluster and bombast, Johnson-type behaviour, Boris Johnson I have in mind, but it has to be a genuine engagement with the substantive issues. And on that, the Russian public morale, yes, they want the war to end, but they now understand that it's it's an existential thing, just as it is for Ukraine. And so, in a sense, we need honest brokers to deal with the substantive issues, to get to some sort of peace. And the idea of a ceasefire, the call for a ceasefire is just simply a code word, let's continue the war. In other words, we stop where we are with an armed Ukraine and the whole thing starts again shortly afterwards. That's not the way it should end. It should end with a genuine peace, with dealing with all the key issues.
So, Rina, Richard saying that Russia has the capacity to carry on this war financially. But for President Trump, there's a bit of a ticking clock here, isn't there? Because he really wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize. That might motivate him to get things moving.
Well, motivated, yes, of course, because Trump has an itch for the Nobel Peace Prize. It's like his North Star, if you will. So ending Ukraine in quote unquote 24 hours was his campaign catnip last year. And now sanctions show that he's got skin in the game. But it's ego fueled. We can't forget that. Deliver peace, claim the prize. Stall out, blame Putin. So again, the motivation is high here, but watch him chase that Oslo glow harder than a Mar-a-Lago golf ball. I really think that, again, is his motivating factor here. But I do think peace is possible here. We do have to ask about NATO. What about it? Truly, NATO is the alliance that ate Russia's lunch. It's enlarged, it's armed, and it's unbreakable. From Finland's border to Roots Resolve, I think Trump has griped at the dues, but sanctions prove that Trump is no pullout artist here. And it restrains Putin, the NATO alliance does, while also bolstering Kiev. And that's firewalls if the talks sour. So weakening NATO is Putin's dream here, and it's just not America's. So I think we need to keep that front and center here about what is Trump's motivating factor and his outlook on how he potentially brokers peace here.
So, Svetlana, this is not a simple situation, is it? President Trump claiming he's solved 8 wars in 8 months. But this is not straightforward, perhaps more difficult than Trump himself thought it was. He promised on the campaign trail to finish the war in 24 hours. This is a different story, isn't it?
Yes, of course. And I would like to explain a bit about the ceasefire in Ukraine. So the idea that Russia and Ukraine and the US should negotiate the final deal before the ceasefire is enforced comes directly from the Kremlin. And it allows the Kremlin to continue advance on the front line, bomb Ukrainian civilians, bombed the electric power stations, the kindergarten that was bombed in Kiev last week. So Putin wants just to continue his war while he is having nice meeting with Trump, just as it happened in Alaska. He made nice photos, but nothing nothing came out of that meeting. He didn't agree even to freeze the fighting for 3 days, for a week, nothing. Putin is not interested in a ceasefire, in a peace. And Trump, he used all of his team, the best negotiators. They were talking with Russia for months and nothing has changed. Just with talking and giving Russia carrots doesn't work.
So if Presidents Trump and Putin do get round the table again after Alaska, could that make a difference? Will that shift things?
Not in and of itself. As Putin said right from the beginning, there has to be a process. They met, some of the representatives met in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia a few months ago. Then Ukraine complained about the low-level delegation. Moscow said, OK, we'll up the delegation. There were 3 working parties which came up with ideas. No response from Kiev at all. And as well, this obsession with a ceasefire, which is, of course, we'd all love to see it, but it has to deal with certain issues. And if they were going to meet, they have to decide on Ukraine's status, neutral or what, force status. There's a whole stack of issues, which, again, are not just a question of a few years now, and all the way back even to the Minsk Accords back in 2014. Obviously, it's terrible the way that Ukrainian civilians are suffering. Obviously, we want to see an end to it. But of course, the Donbass civilians have suffered all the way since 2014. We had a Minsk Accords, which would have returned the Donbass, that's Donetsk and Lugansk, to Ukrainian sovereignty. It would have meant some sort of quasi-federal system. Why not? Lots of other states have it. We have it in the United Kingdom, Wales, Scotland. And yet they refused. They bombed marketplaces and how many civilians, whom I've been talking to in Donetsk and Lugansk, the way that their kindergartens, and they were, for 10 years, they were under bombardment. Of course, it's...
Under whose bombardment further?
Ukrainian forces.
I was in Ukraine and I was writing about that and I was talking to the soldiers. And Russia has been bombing Donetsk. And all this narrative that Ukraine has been bombing Donetsk since 2014.
In Donetsk. This is insane.
They invaded Donetsk and they flattened, they burned out the cities. Look at the Donetsk right now and what they did with Russian people. Look at the mass graves in Donetsk, in Izium. Who killed those people? Russian army came and they murdered them and they tortured them. The Ukrainians didn't do it. Russia bombed out and flattened cities to the ground.
2014 and 2022, when you say invasion, yes, Russia intervened twice at Ilovaisk and Debaltseve, but basically this was an internal conflict which Ukraine was unable.
I'm sorry, you're repeating Putin's points. I even don't want to. I can't believe in the 4th years of war you are repeating Putin's points. It doesn't make sense even to talk about.
Have your say, but I think the details. Clearly, both sides have different points of view. I want to talk about, hopefully, how this will be resolved. Rina, do you think a discussion between President Trump and President Putin, another discussion, could start to shift things when clearly there are very intractable views on both sides?
Well, look, a lot of us here in Washington are wondering about time limits, essentially. When are we going to see the end of this? And there is really no ticking clock. You know, Putin has dug in for attrition here, but sanctions are the hourglass, and oil is dry by mid-2026. Winter bites much harder. So this will drag on if Trump blinks. It ends if Europe floods Kiev with patriots. And I think perpetual war here is a loser's bet. We need peace by spring of 2026, or Putin's pirate parade will drag on forever. And then when you talk to experts around town, of course, there are some varied viewpoints of how do we get to a peace deal. I myself have accepted this notion that there are 3 pillars here. Number 1 is pain. So sanctions that starve the war machine. Number 2, pressure in the form of NATO and China tag teaming Moscow. Thirdly, pragmatism. You know, Zelensky may be yielding lines for guarantees. So no heroes here, just hard math is what we need to see in order for Putin to cede his gains. And then Ukraine gets ironclad security. The deal is done when egos yield to economics. I think that is the point in time we are sitting at.
Richard, does Russia want peace?
Just want to say that the personalization of this war is very dangerous. We keep talking about Putin wants this, Putin talking points. These are parts of a discourse and debate which has been going on since the end of the Cold War, but obviously with intensity over the last 10 years. And to say that this is Putin's war is a mistake. The issues raised were by Gorbachev way back early on, Yeltsin as well about NATO enlargement, Boris Yeltsin, who was president in the 1990s, and Putin right from the beginning, who tried to resolve the NATO issue by asking to join it in the first place. And of course, we know why that wasn't able to happen. We have to go to some sort of diplomacy which deals with those larger issues. And to talk about that sort of strategy, there's 4 key issues, very briefly. The first one, obviously, is to deal with the internal Ukrainian thing, however much it's suppressed. Second, we have to deal with the bilateral Ukrainian-Russian. Third, a genuine European security order, a Eurasian one even, and of course the bilateral US-Russian relationship. And to get all 4 lined up is going to be tough, almost impossible.
Svetlana,
I must say I'm struck by this characterization that this is not Putin's war. This is one man who butchers his own people and invaded a sovereign nation. There is nothing else in the year 2025 we can call this but Vladimir Putin's ego and absolutely abhorrent and crimes against humanity that has led this war to the point it's at. There is no debating that, sir.
I completely agree. And just to add, NATO doesn't enlarge. Countries that fear that Russia will invade them join NATO voluntarily, as Finland and Sweden did.
I just want to ask you, as a Ukrainian, Svetlana, rather than what Ukraine wants, what do Ukrainians want?
Ukrainians want Russia to withdraw its forces from all of the Ukrainian territory. Of course, we know in the realistic world it's not going to happen, but Ukrainian wants peace more than anybody else. And we just hope that the peace will come and it will be a fair peace.
Well, thank you all so much for your time today and for coming on to Roundtable. And do remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and all the team here, it's goodbye and thank you for watching.